The kitchen seemed to hum with life, but beneath the ordinary sounds of dripping faucets and ticking clocks, Grace Turner found herself trapped, literally and emotionally. Little did she know, help would arrive in the form of Ethan Grant, a man whose quiet strength would stir something in her heart she hadn't felt in years. Was it just gratitude, or something more? The house was alive with the quiet hum of mundane activity. The ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen seemed louder than usual, echoing faintly against the weathered cabinets. Maggie Harlow stood by the sink, her auburn hair pulled into a loose knot, a fine sheen of sweat glistening on her brow. The faucet had been dripping all morning, and after weeks of ignoring it, she had finally decided to take matters into her own hands. Her small toolbox laid open on the counter. Its contents, a mismatched collection of wrenches and screwdrivers she had inherited from her late husband Maggie, sighed, kneeling awkwardly to peer beneath the sink. Her knees creaked as she shifted, twisting the wrench with more force than necessary. The pipe groaned in protest, and before she could react, her arm slipped into the tight space, wedging itself between two rusted fixtures. "Damn it," she emmed, pulling back instinctively, only to find her arm stuck. Panic flared briefly as she tugged harder, the edges of the pipe digging into her skin. The pain was sharp but manageable, yet it was the helplessness of the situation that made her stomach twist. She leaned back awkwardly, attempting to maneuver herself into a better position, but the movement only seemed to worsen her predicament. Maggie closed her eyes, exhaling deeply to steady her herself. "Okay?" "Think," she whispered. Just think her phone was on the counter just out of reach. She could see the screen glowing faintly, a message notification blinking. She cursed her stubbornness for tackling the repair herself. It wasn't just about saving money. It was about proving she could handle things on her own. She had spent the past year rebuilding her independence, brick by brick, after losing her husband, but now in the quiet kitchen, trapped and vulnerable. She felt an unsettling mixture of frustration and embarrassment. The sound of the front door creaking open startled her. Maggie's heart leapt, and for a brief moment she froze, her thoughts racing. Who would be entering her house unannounced? The soft thud of footsteps followed hesitant but deliberate moving through the hallway. Maggie craned her neck, trying to glimpse the intruder, her pulse quickening. "Maggie," a voice called out. Deep and familiar relief flooded through her as she recognized it. Caleb Ethan Grant was the son of her late husband's closest friend. A thoughtful young man in his early 20s. He had been a steady presence in her life since the funeral, helping with small tasks and checking in on her occasionally. Maggie had always appreciated his kindness, but she hadn't expected him today. In here, she called her voice tinged with equal parts relief and embarrassment. Caleb appeared in the doorway moments later, his tall frame filling the narrow space. His hazel eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene. Maggie crouched awkwardly by the sink, her arm trapped beneath the fixture, a faint sheen of panic on her face. "What happened?" he asked. Stepping closer, concern etched into his features. "I got stuck trying to fix this stupid pipe," Maggie admitted, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't think it would be this complicated." Caleb knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. "Let me take a look," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. He reached out his fingers, brushing against hers as he examined the pipe. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Maggie that she hadn't anticipated. "It's pretty tight," Caleb murmured, frowning slightly. "I'm going to try loosening it. Hold still." Maggie nodded, her throat dry as she watched him work. His hands were steady, his focus intense as he twisted the wrench. She couldn't help but notice the way his brow furrowed in concentration, or the faint scent of cologne that lingered in the air between them. It was a moment of strange intimacy, unexpected and disarming. Caleb said after a few tense minutes, the pipe released with a metallic groan, and Maggie's arm slipped free. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, flexing her fingers experimentally. "Thank She said, her voice softer now. I don't know what I would have done without you. Caleb smiled a boyish grin that momentarily broke the tension. Glad I could help, he said. But maybe next time call me before you start playing plumber. Maggie laughed, a sound that felt almost foreign after weeks of solitude, noted. She said, her tone lighter. Caleb stood, offering her a hand to help her up. Maggie hesitated for a moment before taking it, her palm pressing against his. The warmth of his touch lingered even after she let go, a small detail that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Are you okay? Caleb asked, his tone shifting back to one of genuine concern. His eyes searched hers, and Maggie felt an unspoken question lingering in the air between them. I'm fine, she said quickly, brushing her hands against her jeans. Just embarrassed. There's no need to be. Caleb, said his voice gentle. Everyone needs help. Sometimes Maggie nodded, but the word struck a chord deep within her. She had spent so long trying to prove she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But in this moment, with Caleb standing in her kitchen, his presence steady and grounding, she couldn't deny the comfort of having someone to lean on as Caleb moved to clean up the scattered tools. Maggie found herself watching him, her thoughts a swirl of gratitude and something she couldn't quite name, the vulnerability of the moment, the quiet intimacy of their interaction. It left her feeling exposed in a way she hadn't expected. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passage of time. But Maggie hardly noticed the morning had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated, and as she stood there in the quiet kitchen, she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The kitchen felt different now, though Maggie couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the faint echo of vulnerability still hanging in the air, or the way the morning sunlight seemed sharper, illuminating every corner of the room as though it were exposing secrets. She stood by the sink, staring blankly at her arm, where faint red marks from the pipe lingered. This light sting was a reminder of the earlier chaos, but it wasn't the discomfort in her arm that unsettled her. It was Caleb. He was still there, kneeling by the cabinet, carefully sorting the tools back into her mismatched toolbox. His movements were deliberate, his focus unwavering, but there was a quiet energy about him that filled the space between them. Maggie couldn't help but watch him, her gaze lingering longer than she intended. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was simply thankful for his help, but a part of her knew there was more to it. You're lucky this didn't get worse, Caleb said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Concern, maybe, or frustration. Maggie blinked, snapping herself out of her thoughts. I know, she said quickly. I should have just called someone. Yes, Caleb agreed, looking up at her with a faint smile. You should have. His tone was teasing, but his hazel eyes held a warmth that made Maggie's chest tighten. She forced a laugh, brushing her hands against her jeans as though trying to shake off the weight of the moment. Well, now I know better, she said, her voice lighter than she felt. Caleb finished packing the toolbox and stood his tall frame, making the small kitchen feel even smaller. He held the box in one hand, his other resting casually on his hip. Where do you want this? He asked, gesturing to the toolbox. Just leave it on the chair, Maggie replied, motioning vaguely. I'll put it away later. Caleb nodded, setting the box down with a soft thud. He lingered by the counter for a moment, his gaze drifting around the room before settling back on her. You sure you're okay? He asked, his tone softer now. Maggie hesitated, her breath catching as she met his gaze. There was something disarming about the way he looked at her, steady, unwavering, as though he could see past the walls she had spent years building. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. I'm fine, she said, finally, her voice firm but not convincing. Caleb tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to tend with me, you know. He said it's okay to admit when you need help. The word struck a chord deep within her. Maggie looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sink as she tried to steady herself. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "but I'm used to handling things on my own." "You don't have to, though," Caleb said, stepping closer. His voice was still calm, but there was an intensity to it now, a quiet insistence that made her chest ache. "You don't always have to do everything alone." Maggie's eyes flicked back to him, her green gaze meeting his hazel one. She wanted to argue to tell him he didn't understand, but the sincerity in his expression made the words catch in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her lips curving into a faint, reluctant smile. "The Aang," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb smiled in return, a small boyish grin that made the tension in the room feel a little less heavy. Anytime he said simply. The moment lingered, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Maggie felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Gratitude, relief. Something warmer, something heavy. It was all there, tangled together in a way that left her feeling unsteady. Caleb cleared his throat, stepping back slightly as though sensing her discomfort. "I should probably get going," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes still searching hers. "Of course," Maggie said quickly, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I'm sure you have things to do." "Yeah," Caleb said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He lingered for a moment longer before nodding. "But if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." Maggie nodded, her throat tight, as she watched him turn and head toward the door. She followed him to the front hall, her footsteps slow and measured. When he reached the door, he paused, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Take care of yourself, Maggie," he said softly. "I will," she replied, her voice barely audible. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Maggie stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. The house felt impossibly quiet. Now, the stillness pressing down on her like a weight. She turned back toward the kitchen, her steps heavy as she tried to shake off the lingering sense of unease. But as she stood by the sink staring out the window at the sunlit yard, she couldn't ignore the way her heart raced, or the thoughts that kept circling in her mind. Caleb's words, his touch, the way he had looked at her. It all felt significant, in a way she couldn't quite explain. Maggie exhaled deeply, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the counter. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this something had shifted, and there was no going back. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft, fragmented beams across the living room floor. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant chirping of birds outside. Maggie sat on the sofa, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. She had been staring at the same page of her book for nearly 20 minutes, her eyes skimming over the words without absorbing a single one. Her mind was elsewhere. Specifically, it was on Caleb. Ever since he had left that morning, his words and the quiet strength of his presence lingered with her. There was something disarming about him, something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite put into words. She told herself it was nothing, just gratitude for his help, but deep down she knew it was more. The sound of the front door opening startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Maggie tensed, setting her tea down on the coffee table as her heart quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone for a brief moment. Panic flared, an irrational fear that something was wrong. But then she heard Caleb's voice, warm and familiar, calling out from the hallway. "It's just me," he said, his tone casual. Maggie exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She stood brushing her hands against her jeans as she moved toward the doorway. "Caleb," she called. "What are you doing here?" He appeared in the entryway, a faint smile on his lips. He held up a small plastic bag. "He left this in the kitchen," he said. "Figured I'd drop it off." Maggie frowned. Stepping closer, inside the bag was a jar of honey, one she vaguely remembered setting aside while they had been cleaning up. She couldn't help but smile at his thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to do that," she said, taking the bag from him. "I was in the neighborhood," he replied with a shrug, but the way his gaze lingered on her suggested otherwise. "Well, thank you." Maggie said, her voice soft. She motioned toward the living room. "Do you want to sit for a bit?" "I just made tea." Caleb hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure, he said, I could use a break. They moved to the living room, the air between them carrying a quiet tension that neither seemed willing to acknowledge. Maggie poured him a cup of tea, her movements careful and deliberate, as though this simple act required her full concentration when she handed him the cup. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a small jolt, a fleeting but unmistakable sensation that made her pulse quicken. They sat across from each other, the coffee table a barrier that felt both necessary and suffocating. For a while they sipped their tea, in silence, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the room. Maggie could feel Caleb watching her, his gaze steady and searching, and it made her chest tighten. "You seem distracted," he said, finally breaking the silence. Maggie looked up, her green eyes meeting his, just tired. She said, the excuse feeling hollow, even as she spoke it. Caleb nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She looked away, her gaze falling to her hands as she tried to steady herself. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firmer now. "Really, you don't have to be, Caleb," said his tone soft but insistent. "Not with me." Maggie's breath hitched at his words, and she felt a wave of emotions rise within her. Gratitude, vulnerability, and something warmer, something more dangerous. She looked back at him, her chest tightening. She gestured to the armchair across from her, and Caleb moved toward it, lowering himself into the seat, with a careful deliberation that made her chest ache. The coffee table between them felt like a fragile barrier, holding back the weight of everything they were avoiding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was waiting for one of them to break it. Maggie's hand tightened around the edges of her book, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to find her voice. "Caleb," she began, her tone wavering. "We need to talk." His gaze sharpened, the hesitation in his expression, replaced by something more focused. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know," he said simply. Maggie's chest tightened further at the simplicity of his response. She set the book aside, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me." Caleb said, his tone steady but not forceful. His hazel eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, as though he was searching for something in her expression. "I've been holding back because I didn't want to make things harder for you, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel." Maggie's breath hitched, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild animal trying to escape. She looked away, her gaze falling to the coffee table as she tried to steady herself. "Caleb, this is complicated," she said, her voice trembling. "There's so much we haven't considered." "I've considered everything," Caleb replied, his voice firmer now. "I've thought about it every day, every moment I'm around you. And I know it's not simple, but that doesn't make it any less real." Maggie closed her eyes, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was, she felt it too. The connection between them, the pull that seemed to draw them closer with every interaction. It was undeniable no matter how much. She tried to ignore it. "Well, now?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't keep it inside anymore," Caleb said, his tone softening. "I can't sit here and act like everything is normal when it's not. Not for me." Maggie looked up at him, her green eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I've spent so long trying to rebuild my life to prove that I can do this on my own. And now you don't have to." Caleb interrupted gently. He leaned forward further, his hands resting on the edge of the coffee table. "Maggie, you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever this is, whatever happens, I'm here for you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Maggie felt a tear slip down her cheek. She reached up to wipe it away, her hands trembling. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what this means, of what it could do to us." "I am too," Caleb said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "But I'd rather face that fear than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Maggie's heart ached at the vulnerability in his tone, the raw honesty in his expression. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the sincerity in his hazel eyes, the same eyes that had always looked at her with kindness, with understanding, and now with something more. "I don't know if I can do this," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Caleb said without hesitation. "You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together." Maggie's chest tightened, her breath catching as she felt the weight of his words sink in. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the possibility of something good, something real. But the fear of the unknown, the fear of what they might lose, held her back. "We need time," she said, her voice firmer now. "We need to take this slow to figure out what this really is." Caleb nodded, his expression softening. "I'll follow your lead," he said, quietly. "Whatever you need, Maggie. I'm here." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet determination in his eyes made her chest ache. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand in a tentative gesture of trust. For a moment the world seemed to still, the space between them, charged with unspoken emotions, as the clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Maggie realized that this conversation was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and choices they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to amplify every creak of the house and every breath taken within its walls. Maggie sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The book she had attempted to read earlier lay forgotten on the coffee table, its pages splayed open like an unresolved question. She stared at the darkened window, her reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time in years, she felt completely exposed. Not to the world, but to herself. Her thoughts were a tangled web, every strand leading back to Caleb. His words from their last conversation echoed in her mind, their honesty and vulnerability cutting through the walls she had spent years building. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate life's challenges alone. But now she found herself questioning everything. She thought she knew about strength and solitude. The faint sound of footsteps on the stairs broke her reverie. Maggie's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't ready to face him. Not tonight. Not when her emotions felt so raw. But there was no escaping this. Caleb's presence in the house was an undeniable reality, and she knew they couldn't keep tiptoeing around the tension between them. My footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until they stopped just outside the living room. Maggie turned her head slightly, her gaze fixed on the doorway. Caleb appeared moments later, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He hesitated for a moment, his hazel eyes searching hers as though seeking permission to enter. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, his voice low but steady. Maggie shook her head, her lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. "Seems to be a theme lately," she replied. Caleb stepped into the room, his movements careful, almost tentative. He didn't sit right away instead, standing near the armchair as though he was waiting for her to invite him further into her space. The air between them was heavy, charged with unspoken words and emotions. Neither of them knew how to articulate. "Do you want to talk about it?" Caleb asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Maggie looked away her gaze, falling to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. "I don't know if talking will help," she admitted. "It feels like the more we talk, the more complicated things get. Sometimes it has to get complicated before it gets clear." Caleb said, his voice tinged with quiet conviction. He lowered himself into the armchair across from her, leaning forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. "But we can't keep avoiding this, Maggie, not anymore." Her chest tightened at his words, a mix of fear and relief washing over her. She had spent so long running from her feelings, convincing herself that denying them was the safest option. But Caleb's steady presence, his unwavering patience, made it impossible to keep running. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You don't know what it's like to feel this scared. To feel like everything you've built could crumble in an instant." Caleb's hazel eyes softened, and he reached out his hand, resting lightly on the edge of the coffee table between them. "Then let me understand," he said. "Let me in. Maggie, I'm here because I want to be. Because I care. About you. But I need you to let me." Her breath hitched her chest, aching with the weight of his words. She looked at him. Really, looked at him, and saw the quiet strength in his expression, the same strength that had drawn her to him, in ways she hadn't dared to acknowledge. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in." Caleb's gaze didn't waver, his expression steady and reassuring. "You don't have to know," he said. "We'll figure it out together, but you don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet determination in his eyes made her throat tighten. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she reached up to wipe it away, her hand trembling. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not simple," Caleb said, his tone firm but gentle. "But it's worth it. You're worth it." Maggie's chest ached, a mixture of fear and longing coursing through her. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the possibility of something good, something real. But the walls she had built around herself were high, and letting them crumble felt like an impossible task. "I'm scared," she said, finally, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this means, of what it could do to us." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm scared too," he said, "but I'd rather face that fear than lose the chance to see where this could go." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Maggie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, and it made her chest tighten in a way that was both painful and exhilarating. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their conversation settling around them like a quiet storm. Maggie looked at Caleb, her green eyes searching his for answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find, and yet in his steady gaze, she felt a sense of reassurance, a quiet strength that made her want to believe. "I don't know where this will lead," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, "but I don't want to run from it anymore." Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. "That's all I needed to hear," he said. Maggie exhaled deeply, a weight lifting from her chest, even as new questions formed in her mind. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and risks they couldn't yet foresee. but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of possibility, a flicker of light in the darkness. The early morning sunlight crept through the curtains, illuminating the room with a soft golden hue that seemed almost otherworldly. Maggie sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her mug, the tea inside long forgotten her reflection in the window. Faint and ethereal mirrored the conflicting emotions storming within her. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of old wood and the distant hum of birdsong. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was electric. Charged with all the things left unsaid, she had spent the entire night turning over their conversation, replaying every word, every glance. The weight of Caleb's sincerity lingered, wrapping around her like an invisible tether. There was no escaping the truth. Something had shifted between them. It was undeniable, like a current pulling them both toward uncharted waters, and that terrified her. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs broke through her thoughts, sharp and deliberate. Maggie froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected him to come down so early. She hadn't prepared herself for this moment. The footsteps grew closer, each one sending ripples through her chest until Caleb appeared in the doorway. He was barefoot, his dark hair tousled from sleep, wearing only a fitted t-shirt and sweatpants that hung low on his hips. The soft morning light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the relaxed strength in his frame. He looked impossibly casual, yet somehow entirely deliberate, his presence filling. The room like a quiet storm couldn't sleep either, huh? His voice was low, slightly hoarse, and it sent a shiver through her that she hoped he didn't notice. Maggie cleared her throat, gripping the mug tighter as if it could anchor her. Not really. She said, her voice steady but quiet. Too much on my mind. Same. Caleb replied, stepping into the room. He leaned casually against the doorway, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement drew her eyes unbidden to the subtle flecks of muscle beneath his shirt. She quickly averted her gaze, her cheeks warming. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same quiet intensity that always managed to unravel her. "You've been up all night," he observed. "You should have woken me." Maggie forced a small smile, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. What would that have solved? She asked, her tone light but tinged with something deeper. Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "Maybe nothing," he admitted, "but you wouldn't have been alone." The sincerity in his voice struck her soft but firm, and it made her chest tighten. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. "I've gotten used to being alone," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You shouldn't have to be." "Caleb," said his voice, steady but filled with something she couldn't quite name. He stepped closer, then his movements slow and deliberate. Maggie felt her pulse, quicken, her breath catching as he crossed the invisible line she hadn't even realized she'd drawn. He stopped just a foot away, his presence overwhelming. In the small space she could feel the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of cedar, and something unmistakable. "Him, Maggie," he said softly, her name on his lips carrying a weight that made her shiver. "We can't keep dancing around this." Her heart pounded a wild rhythm that echoed in her ears. She looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his, hazel ones. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only quiet determination and something deeper, something that made her breath hitch. "This is complicated," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You know that I know," Caleb said, his tone gentle but firm. "But that doesn't make it any less real." Maggie opened her mouth to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. He reached out, then his hand brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was barely there, a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through her that she couldn't ignore. "You feel it too," he said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet, undeniable truth. Maggie's breath caught her chest tightening as she struggled to find her footing in the moment she wanted to deny it. To tell him he was wrong. But the intensity in his gaze, the quiet certainty in his voice left her defenseless. Caleb. She began, her voice barely audible, but before she could say more, he stepped closer, his hand slipping from her arm to gently cup her face. "Just tell me one thing," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Do you want this?" Her chest ached with the weight of his question, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. But there was no fear in his gaze, only patience, and that made her want to leap. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to want something without being afraid of losing it." "You don't have to be afraid." Caleb said, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. "Not with me." Maggie's resolve crumbled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She reached up her fingers, curling lightly around his wrist. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I don't want to run anymore." "That's all I needed to hear," Caleb said. Softly, he leaned in, then his forehead resting lightly against hers. The moment hung suspended, the world around them, fading into nothing. Maggie closed her eyes, her breath mingling with his, and for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. The morning light continued to filter through the curtains, casting the room in a warm golden glow. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed, but for Maggie, everything had shifted, and there was no turning back. Grace Turner stood in her now quiet kitchen, staring at her reflection in the window. The events of the day had left her shaken, not because of the mishap with the sink, but because of Ethan Grant's words and lingering presence. Was this the start of a new chapter, or simply a fleeting moment of vulnerability? Only time would tell, but one thing was clear. Everything had changed.